will be no spoilers. Here we are in the heart of New York City at B&A Superstore, and we are streaming live to you, and we're doing this live. This is a pretty big deal. I want to recap the story that as I'm getting ready this morning, my wife says, so what's going on today? And I was like, we have a Photoshop legend coming in today, a superstar. And she's like, how can you be a Photoshop legend? And Matt Kloskowski will show you how you can be a Photoshop legend. He's a man who's been in the industry for 20 years. You've been over 20 years?
No. Probably 15, 20-ish.
15, 20, still very humble. Matt has taught Photoshop techniques, Lightroom techniques for Adobe for across the country, actually internationally. You've been all over.
All over the place.
All over doing it, and it is an honor and a privilege to have Matt here today. For those of you that don't have Photoshop, we do have an in-store special. So for you guys that are here, we talked about how you can get your special $20 off of Photoshop. For those of you that are watching online, Matt will be back here in a couple of hours at 1 o'clock where you can take advantage of that special. That special $20 off Photoshop is only here in the store today, and it ends at 7 o'clock when the store closes. So we got a great double header for you guys today. Got Matt Kloskowski. Are you ready to go?
Alrighty.
All right, Matt, and by the way, thanks for coming.
Thanks, man.
Right on.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. We'll welcome everybody in here, and I don't even know what camera to look at, but there's a camera out there. Welcome to everybody out there on the web as well. We're here in this first class today. It's going to be Lightroom and Photoshop for landscape photographers. Landscape, outdoor, nature, a little bit of everything. And so the idea behind this is we're going to start off in Lightroom. We're going to build, right? We'll build as we go. So we'll start off with a few photo examples, just some of the basic stuff and just, kind of work some of the sliders. Add a little bit to it where we get into some of the brushes and some of the filters that we have, and then we'll jump over into Photoshop when we need to and kind of keep on building from there. If you would do me a huge favor, so we got 10 a.m. If you do me a huge favor, I will leave plenty of time for your questions. And throughout, I'll probably stop and take a couple of questions here and there, just hopefully as it relates to what I was teaching there. But if you've just got a totally different question, totally off question related to something I'm not talking about here, I will leave plenty of time at the end to grab those questions. So if you would, kind of let me plow through some of my examples here, and then that way I'll have enough time for your questions at the end. Cool? All right. That was a question. All right, so let's go ahead here and get started. Where it's necessary, I'll kind of give you a little bit of was that a hand?
No.
Okay. I was like, that's a question. Let's go ahead and dive in here. So, outdoor photography, I think, when we start to think about editing. This is really where, to me, the biggest challenges are going to be typically shadows and highlights. If you think about once we take that camera outdoors and we start to photograph nature and landscapes and wildlife and whatever it is, the one thing we really lose control over is the lighting. Okay, we can move ourselves around and we can try to position ourselves, but we're not really going to be lugging flashes around and photographing deer and all that stuff. You get to a big lake, I don't care if you have a flash, if there's a mountain that's a mile off in the distance, there's nothing you're going to do to be able to change the lighting. So what I usually try to do is I get it as close as I can in the camera. Things that I've learned over the years are I can boost my shadows really, really well. Believe it or not, there's so much information and highlights. So if you look at this photo, I mean, I can move 2 sliders, and these are usually where I'll start for my landscape stuff. Shadows, highlights. I mean, seriously, like, it instantly changes the photo. So I think with our landscapes and our outdoor stuff, I think that's probably some of the biggest things that we can do here. And guys, this is out of the camera raw file. Look, I'll hit reset. All right, out of the camera raw file. boost the shadows, pull back the highlights. All right. If I zoom in, for those of you wondering, well, if you open up the shadows, don't you get noise? No, they weren't. If you look at them, they weren't black. It's not like I took black and I started to open up those shadows. So there's a lot of leeway in there. All right, from here, one of the other things that I do, and again, I'm going to kind of go through my basics. I'll start to move through them faster as we go, just so I don't keep repeating myself. But one of the things that's kind of always been part of my workflow are whites and blacks. So what I can do is we have the histogram, all right? The histogram, if you look over on this side, that's going to be your white point. All right? And if you look over on this side, that's going to be your black point. So we have the histogram, and we could adjust our whites and blacks, and we could monitor that. I'm personally not a big histogram person, because the only thing I really care about the histogram, do I have white and do I have black? It's the only thing I care about it. The rest of it is irrelevant, because it's going to look different for every photo. There is no right histogram, okay? So the way that I do this is I hold down the Option or Alt key and I click on whites, and you'll see everything goes black. And as I drag this to the right, I start to see a couple little white specks here, okay? Once I hit that, I know I've got a white point. Let me go ahead, let me hide that panel on the left there too, give us some more room. So I got a white point. And then if I hold down Option or Alt again and I click on blacks and I drag that, you can start to see some little black areas appear. That means I have a black point. All right? So what does this do for me? Well, if I go and look at the histogram again, you'll see before there was a tiny little gap there. There's not now. So I've basically given myself that white point. I've given myself that black point. Does two things. It gives me contrast, but it also gives me, what's the word I'm looking for? It gives me a little bit of consistency. All right, just by moving whites and blacks, I get contrast. That's kind of a gimme. If you think of a contrast slider, and if you ever notice, you usually see me skip the contrast slider. All right, what's contrast do? Contrast makes blacks blacker and whites whiter. So I get that with whites and blacks, but the other part is consistency. So where my screen is right now, this is my editing environment. Your screen may be near a window. Yours may be in a dark room. Yours may be with a light overhead, or what. Everybody's screen's going to be in a different place. And what'll happen is that's going to affect how you start to look at your photos. A white point and a black point is always going to be consistent. I could open this photo on any one of your computers, and it's always going to be the same. So it gives me a little bit of consistency in how I edit my photos. In this day and age, that's about the best we can hope for, okay? Once this photo leaves my computer screen, and you guys may be all great, you may all calibrate your computer screens every week, and I don't think you do. But let's just say all of you do. That is, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the percentage of people that are out there that are viewing photos. So it doesn't matter if you calibrate your screen. Me and a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of people will all see my photo the way that I intended. The rest of the world, there's nothing you can do about it. The people are looking at their photos on their phone, they're looking on their tablet, they're looking on their computer screens. There's nothing you can do other than at least have a consistency to your work. And that way, if their screen is dark, they're going to think all my photos are dark. They're going to think all my photos are white. But it does give some degree of consistency in there. All right, so that's a little bit about the histogram up there. Clarity. Remember how I said contrast, those blacks and whites? Blacks blacker, whites whiter. So what about everything in between? If we're thinking all the tones of gray, that's where clarity comes in. You may have seen this if you used to use Nik. You may have seen it in some plugins out there. There's something called Structure. That's a very similar thing. So clarity basically gives you a contrast in those middle areas there. So if you look at it, you start to see it change there. couple things that I notice about clarity are it will tend to make things, it'll tend to make your brights a little bit brighter, and it tends to desaturate things a little bit. It tends to take a little bit of the saturation away if you look at this photo here. So it's one of those settings. I'm careful with it. You know, if I have a lot of detail in the photo, I'll do it. If it's a portrait, probably not. You know, bricks and walls and things like that, it works really good. Wildlife, it usually works good on feathers and stuff, but just have to make sure you use it in sparingly doses. Vibrance, usually it'll boost colors, but it'll leave skin tones alone. Saturation boosts everything. Okay? Saturation you gotta be careful with because it can get radioactive pretty quick. So if it's a landscape photo, I'm generally going to use saturation though. And I can tell you I rarely go above like 10, 12. That's where it starts to get bad. All right, so a little bit of saturation there. Just to show you where we're at, again, backslash key shows you the before, backslash key shows you the after. All right, from there, I don't do anything with the tone curve. For me personally, the tone curve is it's one of those legacy tools kind of left in there for curve junkies from Photoshop. So if you grew up with Photoshop and that's what you used all the time, you know, curves were a very powerful tool back then. But really, you know, our goal with curves was to kind of work with the whites, work with the blacks. You could access your midtones in here. We've got sliders to do that. So if you're the kind of person that likes to maybe dig in a little bit more, the curve might be for you. Personally, I usually just use the sliders. Let's see here, HSL. So hue, saturation, luminance. On this photo, you know, I think we're pretty well saturated. You know, hue's going to change the hue of the blues or whatever color I choose there. I can go to luminance sometimes on a landscape photo. If you go to the blues, if you go to the left on the luminance slider, you can kind of darken the sky a little bit. All right? Almost as if, you know, you had a circular polarizer on and turned it a little bit too much. So we don't want to go crazy with it, but we can add a little bit there. Let's see here. We won't do a black and white just yet. Split toning. Split toning lets you get a tint in your shadows or your highlights. I do that more with a black and white, so we'll look at an example later. Detail. Let's talk sharpening and noise reduction. So, sharpening. First thing I'll tell you about sharpening. It is probably one of the things I get asked about the most. The interesting part about sharpening is it's the thing that I spend the least amount of time on. Like, I literally, like, I'll take the photo, I'll sit here, I'll zoom in, I'll be like, huh, looks pretty sharp, okay. You know, if there's a key area, if I want to make sure, you know, I'm trying to think of what a key part of this would be. We just look at the mountain. I mean, I'll take my mount slider, I'll crank it up to 100, I'm like, okay, doesn't look bad, and I'm done. I honestly don't spend any more time on it. But I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm looking for. And then, you know, we can talk a little bit about some of the questions that I get around it. What I'm looking for is that I just really don't introduce texture into the photo. So I will push the sliders basically almost as far as I can without introducing texture. Right? What do I mean by texture? I mean, I don't want to go over here and I don't want to crank up my mount slider, maybe crank up my detail slider, and I don't know if you guys can see that. That's texture, okay? So I'm trying not to introduce that. I'm trying to add enough sharpening that basically, you know, sharpening finds the edges, gives a little bit more contrast to them. So your amount slider, think of that as the contrast slider. How much contrast is it going to add to an edge? Radius, you can usually leave that right around 1. If you have lots of tiny little details, you can go a little bit lower, because what it does, if you think it finds an edge, and then how far outside that edge does it apply that sharpening? So you don't want to go too high on it because you get that halo-y kind of glow around your edges. Detail, you can get into some trouble with detail, because what detail says is if you have it at 0, it's really just targeting the edges, the contrasty stuff. If you crank it up, it starts to look at everything. So what happened here? It starts to sharpen it starts to put that texture into the sky. If this were a portrait, what's going to happen? It's going to start to sharpen the skin tones and everything in there. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So that's why I usually keep our detail down a little bit. If for some reason I get to a spot where I'm like, well, you know what, the detail and the amount look good, but there's still a little too much noise in the sky, you have masking, and that'll mask it away from smooth areas. So if you keep an eye on the sky, see how it goes away? But it's staying here. I'll toggle it on and off. And if you didn't know, there's a little toggle switch there. That's before, that's after. So it is sharpening the photo. You can see it there, but it's keeping it away from the sky. And if you want to watch it happen, you can zoom into, you can go over here, hold down your Option or your Alt key as you drag it. And you can see where it's hiding it from. When it's white, everything's being sharpened. Whatever turns black, that's where it's hiding it from. Noise reduction, landscapes, we're typically on a tripod, so we're not doing too much noise reduction. I'll pull up a wildlife photo in a little while. We'll talk a little bit more about noise reduction. But for your landscapes, usually we're going to have our ISO set down pretty low because we're on a tripod, and we're not going to do too much there. Lens corrections, enable profile corrections. I'm almost always check that. And if you look at what it does, if you look at the edges, kind of gets rid of a little bit of that vignette on the edge there. Okay? I get rid of it because in a second you're going to see that I'm going to add it back in. But it gets rid of kind of the ugly vignette, that really dark corner. That's tough to work with. It doesn't really help the photo, and it's tough to get rid of any other way. All right, so that's our lens corrections here. Transformation, we don't really have anything that's that off axis here to worry about, and then we'll go down here. So remember how I said I got rid of the vignette? One of the things I do is I like to go in and add a vignette back. What I'm looking for is just to darken the edges and kind of bring your focus and just kind of take the focus off the edge. You can see here, I feather it quite a bit, and I use a pretty large vignette because I want it to be very, very smooth. You should usually never see the vignette in most of cases. Nobody should be able to look at the photo and be like, oh, that's a vignette, I can see it. So that's your goal on that, is that you can't tell that you vignetted it. All right, so remember before, we did, if you want to see your before and after photo, you can hold down your backslash key. So backslash shows you the before and the after. And I think you guys, most of you will agree with me that really the magic to this photo, although it went through the settings, the magic to the photo is really done in the basic panel. That's going to be where most of your stuff is done. All right, let's move on to next example here. So this photo for me, this is one of those ones that, I think just it shines in what we can do with the photo after the fact, because getting filters out, trying to do what we can to get the foreground brighter, the sky dark, all these different things. I think the photo doesn't look quite as impressive as it was when I was standing there. And that really is my goal with my landscape photography is I knew what it was like when I was there, and I want to bring that to everybody else. So what I'll usually do here is we'll head over, again, shadows and highlights. That's generally where I'm going to start. So I can open up my shadows. I think we're pretty good on the highlight side. There's nothing that's really too bright here. In fact, if anything, I'm then going to go to exposure. Exposures just make everything brighter. Just make the whole photo brighter. So I'll go over here to exposure. Maybe pull back on that shadow a little bit. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go grab my crop tool, and I'm kind of thinking at this right here is kind of a horizon line. So I'd straighten and rotate around until that looks straight. The other thing that I could do is grab the straighten tool and just click and drag right along. See, it'll straighten that like so. Let's see here. White balance. So as you open up your shadows, a lot of times what's going to happen is your shadows are going to be cooler. They're going to have a colder type of a feeling. I always use the example, if you ever go watch an outdoor sport where maybe the sun's kind of behind the stadium or behind something, and there's people in the shade and there's people in the sunlight, like next time you're out there, if you look at it, when you first glance over to the shade, sometimes it looks cold. Then if you look on the field and you see everybody in the sunlight. So the same thing happens, is it gets kind of cold, it gets a cool feeling. So I'll usually go over here and increase my temperature slider. And that's going to warm everything up. All right. Go down here, whites and blacks, Option or Alt click on whites, drag that till I get a little white point there. Option or Alt click on blacks, drag that till I get a black point. A couple things to think about when you're doing this is, like, I don't want to go there, okay? That's too far, especially if it turns all white. Because what's happening is I've now lost all detail in that area. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I don't want you to take that stuff too seriously. So if you're printing the photo, it matters a little bit more. It's kind of like sharpening, right? If you're not gonna print the photo, God, you're barely ever gonna see your sharpening on the screen. If you're not gonna print the photo, your noise reduction, you're barely ever gonna see your noise reduction on the screen. Same thing with some of the highlights that we really work to keep and not keep. If you're not gonna print the photo, it's not as big of a deal. Because if it goes all white and someone sees it on the screen, it's gonna look normal. But if I do push something to white and I print the photo, what happens? It's generally not gonna lay down any ink in that area. And that's where it could look a little bit off in the print. So you just wanna be careful with that. Your output does matter when you're doing this stuff. So you wanna keep that stuff in mind. And how many people print on a regular basis? Just curious. So there you go. A third of the room raised their hand. And I can tell you just from my experience in talking to crowds, a third of the room raised their hand, but if I went around and sat and talked to everybody, I bet you almost everybody really starts to stress out about sharpening and noise reduction and highlights and detail and all that stuff that really you're only ever going to see inside of the print. So just something to think about. Not every photo needs to be destined for print. Sometimes we just take a photo and we like it and we play with it and we share it or do something like that. It doesn't mean every photo is going to be a big print on our wall. Okay, let's see here. So we got our whites, we got our blacks. A little bit of clarity. I think this photo, has a lot of contrast to begin with here. A little bit of saturation. Look at the yellows in the water. If I go to 15, it's overdone. So a little bit goes a long way there. Let's see here. I'm thinking creatively, I might crop in a little bit more on this one. I don't want to get too close up here. Just trying to remove a little bit of that outside. There we go. Just trying to get that a little bit closer to this left side over here. All right, moving on down the line, tone curve. HSL, there's really not a color in the photo that I want to work with. Sharpening, we'll go ahead. We can, remember, you got to be zoomed in to at least 100%. If you're not sure how to zoom, go over here to your navigator panel on the left side, and you will see Fit, Fill. 1:1 is your 100%. And then this next one over here, you can actually control. You can actually change it to whatever you want it to be, just by picking from that list there. If you came from a Photoshop world, it's just the same shortcuts as Photoshop, Command, Control, plus or minus. so I can use the shortcuts too. All right, so let's kind of take a look in our detail-y areas here. So amount, again, I'll crank that up. What am I looking for? I'm looking for texture. All right. So if I go too far, you know, that's what over sharpened looks like. So we want to I can't give you a formula, but I can tell you what it looks like when you've gone too far. So I will push it as close as I can up until that point, though. So I think we're pretty close there. There's not really, it's not doing anything to the sky that we have to worry about, so not going to worry about that. All right, I took this photo last week in Florida, by the way. We had this huge snowstorm. It was crazy. It's like, came out of nowhere. It was, this was taken by now what I call the most photographed place on Earth, which is Iceland. It's like, I think you will all agree, and I think you guys are all probably equally dreading the hashtag Iceland that is sure to come up in the next couple of months here, because it's like, it seems like the tourism, it's become so accessible to get there. I can't even tell you, like, you go to some of these places and it was literally hundreds of people. You see these waterfalls that you think like, oh God, that looks like a quaint waterfall in Iceland off in a quaint little place that maybe I had to do a little hike to. Nope. It was a big parking lot that you drove up to, and you shared that experience with you and 500 of your favorite tourists. So, now I hope I'm not painting a bad. If you get the chance, because it's guys, I think it's faster for you to go to Iceland here from JFK than it is to get over to Seattle. Because the week that I went to Iceland, I was in Seattle earlier that week, and my flight from Seattle to Atlanta was longer. I actually flew through JFK. That JFK flight, it's like nothing. It was under 5 hours. So it's very accessible. It's a great country. Everybody's so polite. So many people speak English. So I sound like I'm on the tourist board for Iceland, but neat place if you ever get the chance to go. Just understand that you'll be sharing it with many other people. All right, let's see here. I digress. Enable profile corrections. So we'll go ahead and turn that on. You can see here. Works on the edges a little bit. Go down here to effects. We'll put my obligatory vignette around here. A little bit. If I were to finish this, or if I were to take it the next step, so something that we haven't done yet, these little filters up here open up huge possibilities for us. So I'm going to go to the graduated filter. This is probably the closest one that kind of replaces something that we'd use in the camera, which is a graduated neutral density filter you put over the lens. Darken the sky. They go from dark to clear. You use it to darken the sky. So you noticed before when I did two things. I boosted the exposure of the photo. Remember when I did that? And then remember I warmed the whole photo. I took the temperature slider and moved it to the right. That did two things to the sky. It made the sky a little bit brighter than I would care for, and it also made it a little bit more yellow. All right? All of these different lighting conditions exist when we're outside. Our eyes just account for them. Your cameras, and when you get on the screen, they don't. Right? That's why we have to. Our shadows get cool. We can make them warmer, but then we do that to the whole photo. So what I can do over here is take my grad filter. I can bring the exposure down. Bring that exposure slider. And by the way, this is a whole new set of sliders. I see this one all the time. Like, put this down in that little list of things that can go wrong in Lightroom that you might not know of. But you'll want this list when they do. I'll see this all the time. Somebody, they'll accidentally click on the grad filter, or even worse, you'll hit your keyboard. I think the keyboard shortcut's like K or something. And they'll be moving exposure, and they'll be like, why isn't anything happening? And they go, Adobe, this is broken, nothing's happening, look, I'm moving exposure. So just keep in mind, this area looks really, really similar to your basic panel, which has its own set of sliders too, all right? So these sliders are just for any of the filters you're using there. So I'll bring the exposure slider down. I don't really know how much yet. And then I'll just click and drag and pull that down. And that's kind of the like wiping my computer screen. I'm thinking that's a spot, but it's actually a spot on the photo. We'll look at that in a second. So that's kind of the default way. You know, you can move it up and down. You know, this would be a soft grad. This would be a hard transition grad. So I can move that up and down, split that transition more. If I put my cursor near the little point in the middle, I can rotate it. Sorry. Back. And let's see here. And then, here's what's cool, is now the sky's darker, but it's got a little bit more of a muddy look to it. So you can go to your temperature slider and bring back some blue. So now I can work on both of them. Like so. All right, so that's before, and that's after. All right, and when you're done, just hit close. Here's a little tip for you if you want to jot this one down. One of the things you'll notice is as I am working through the basic panel, notice when I click on the tone curve panel, the basic panel closes. So if you don't know about this little trick, if you right click on any of the panel names, so just right click on tone curve, there's something called solo mode. It's the worst name feature in Lightroom. Because you never look at it and be like, oh, solo mode is the single panel mode. But it's what it does is it makes it so here, now it's off, right? So when I open up basic and I open up tone curve, basic stayed open, I open up split toning, detail, you get the idea. And by the end of the day, you know, you're going to spend half your day going like this, back and forth. But if you turn on, right click and turn on solo mode, when I open up a panel and I go to the next panel, it automatically closes the previous panel. So solo mode is really single panel mode in disguise, because there is no actual single panel mode. And then, if you want a little gag, if you have a friend that uses Lightroom, and you just get a couple minutes of access to their computer, if you were to right-click over here on any of the panels, see these little checkboxes? So, like for me, I don't do split toning a whole lot. And usually if I'm going to get that creative, it's because I'm converting to a black and white, and most of the time I'm going to use a plugin. So, I can turn split toning off. You see it disappeared. I can turn transform off. So what you could do is go through here and just right click and just turn them all off. Or if you really want to mess with them, just leave one on, like camera calibration. There we go. So, it's a little trick you can play. Let's go back here to show all. There we go. Okay, so solo mode is on. So there's your quick little tip there. All right, so I think we're looking good. I might, just looking at it, I might open up the exposure a little bit. Maybe a little bit of clarity here. Just a little warmer. All right, so let's take a look. Hit the backslash key. Before, after. Pretty cool stuff. All right, and I didn't get rid of the spot. See that little guy up there? You have a brush right next to the crop tool, and you can use your right and left bracket keys, or you can use the little size slider, and then just click, and it'll get rid of the spot. If you ever don't like where it shows to fix it from, you just move it around. Like sometimes you'll click on it if there's a lot of clouds in the sky, and it'll pick on a cloud to fix it. So if that ever does that, you can just move that around. And then I'll show you an example here, because this is one of those ones. let's go ahead and turn that on. When you choose your spot removal tool up here, if you look down in this little toolbar, there's a little option called Visualize Spots. All right, turn that on, and you move this little slider, you can see the spots. So, and you can actually fix them right here. Like, you don't have to leave this mode to work on them. So, I know they say cover your camera when you're changing lenses. Apparently I like to sneeze in mine, or I ate dinner over it. Something like I went on a photo shoot the other week. I don't know how my sensor got. My sensor was literally, I counted there. I must have done like 150 spots. I don't know how it got that bad. It was so horrible. Anyway, though, but that's a good one, especially if you are going to print. They're harder to see on your screen, and they're harder to see when your photo's a little bit smaller. If you are going to print, I can tell you, and you know, anybody that has printed probably already knows this. Sadly, is there's nothing more frustrating than spending the time and energy and money, and you get that print, and you put it up on the wall, and you walk up to it, and you see like little stuff in the sky. Like, it's very, very frustrating. So make sure you go through and get rid of that stuff. And by the way, most people don't care. Most people that see your photo don't even see it because they don't like walk up to the wall like this. But photographers do. All right, let's see here. So let's take a look. Let's move on to, we're working on pretty weather. Here, let's go to this one. This will be a good. We get to use a few tools in this one. All right. So again, shadows, highlights. I'll pull back on my highlights. Notice when I pull back on the highlights, see what happens to the mountain. So it's getting the sky, but it's also getting the mountain. So this is one of those times where I start to, what's the best way to say it? I start to think about how much do I care about this photo, okay? The easy thing is grab your highlights, pull them down. If I really like this photo, and I don't think I'm the only one that does this. Do you guys have different degrees of like in a photo? Doesn't mean you don't care about it. Doesn't mean you don't want to edit it. Doesn't mean I think if you're in this class, like, I think you actually kind of like editing a little bit. Like, it's kind of therapeutic to sit down and craft the photo and everything. We don't want to do monotonous work, but I think some of the artistic work is fun. So I think about how much I like the photo. If I think, hey, you know what, this is kind of neat, I just want to share it really quick or whatever, you know, it's for some reason or purpose that I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, I'll just grab the shadows and highlights and be done. If I think that photo has that next level of usefulness to me, that's when I start to go into the mode of what other tricks do I have to work on the sky. And that's maybe when I'll start to think about the grad filter and even another feature you're going to see here in a second. So things to keep in mind, if you see me use the highlight slider in one photo and then I do it a harder way in another photo, a lot of times that's the reason why. So as I'm thinking through this, you know, I'm like, all right, I kind of like this photo, so I'm not just going to grab the highlights and pull them down. I think our shadows are actually looking pretty good here. Whites and blacks, Option or Alt-click. We have a white point. Option or Alt-click, drag that to the left. Get a little bit of a black point. Let's see here, clarity. Again, just be careful with it. It does give you a nice little snap to everything, but you don't want to go too far. We can definitely warm this up. This was sunrise. I'm going to go grab my crop tool, and I'm going to use that little shoreline over here as kind of an anchor to straighten from. It's not very off, but just a little bit. So that's our basics. Again, tone curve, I don't really have anything. We could go, yeah, I can play around a little bit on the greens and the yellows. Make those a little bit brighter. Detail. So let's zoom in on our trees. Again, I mean, we're going to push our sliders just enough to where I start to see a little bit of texture. And pull back. So that's our detail. Again, lens correction, same thing, just enable that little profile checkbox there. And then effects. So let's hold off on our vignette till the end here because we're going to do a couple more things to this. So the sky. We want to make that darker. So I can go to my grad filter. Same thing I did before, right? Bring the exposure down, click, drag, position it, and then maybe even use the highlights a little bit too. Kind of a combination of both. Because exposure is just going to make it all darker, where the highlights will bring back a little bit of detail on that mountaintop. So what's the problem that I have here? Just like a grad filter in camera would have done, there's going to be a line, right? Well, something that we haven't seen yet so far, we just used the grad filter, is it's got a couple of different things. It's got a brush option, but a lot of times we can get away with just boosting the shadows. So if you think about what it's doing, is we darkened, this is before, this is after. We just darkened that tree area. Well, if I go over here and I open up the shadows, the sky isn't a shadow, so nothing's happening to the sky. So it actually just lets me boost that area up a little bit. All right. Now, if you need to, if you have something like, let's say, and it didn't really happen too bad here, but let's say this mountaintop started to get too dark. I'm going to press Command plus to zoom in. What we can do is we can go over to the brush tool. So remember I was in the grad filter, but there's a brush option, and that's different from the brush tool. The brush option lets me erase or add to the grad filter. So in this case, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to go into erase mode. And now you can see it's got a little minus. And now what I'll do is I can erase it from the mountain. Now I don't want to because I think it brought back pretty good detail. But the other thing that I can do is maybe if I want to make it a little bit brighter, think of your flow as kind of like opacity, in that maybe I just bring back a little bit. So I can go, basically, think about it this way. I've got this graduated filter that I've darkened the whole sky. It obviously went over the trees, but it went over the mountain too. So now I can take a brush and erase away part of that area that went over the mountain. So it can definitely come in handy. It can be one of those things that, we are this afternoon in our 1 o'clock, we're going to talk about, it's called Photoshop for Lightroom users. We'll jump into Photoshop a couple times here, but this is really like Photoshop, all the different things we could use Photoshop for as a Lightroom user. But something like this could keep us from having to jump over to Photoshop a lot of times. All right, let's go down here. Let's, you know what? Go back to my grad filter. Make that a little bit more blue. And then I'm going to go back here to basic, and I think I'm going to warm the photo a little bit more. Again, make that a little bit, sometimes it's a little push and pull. Okay. And then we'll come down here to effects. Throw a little bit of a vignette on there. If I was being really picky, I'd probably go onto the reflection and maybe make that a little bit darker. I just take the grad filter drag it up from the bottom instead of from the top there. But I think we're actually pretty close on this one here. Last little finishing touch is the brush. So we've seen the grad filter. We've seen, we can darken the sky and do all those things. If I have a strong object in the photo that I want to draw attention to, I'll go and I'll grab the brush, and in this case I'll bring the exposure slider up, and then let's go down here and make my brush smaller. Command plus to zoom in, and then we can just go down here and paint right over there. Now I can make that a little bit brighter. And you can control it. You don't have to know. You don't have to know when you click on it how bright and dark you want to make it. But that to me is the next level. The next level beyond just moving the sliders around and everything. I feel for our landscape photos, we get a lot of depth and dimension by being out there and experiencing it, and we see a lot of it. And I think when you get that very lifelike experience onto a two-dimensional screen, I think you lose something. I think you lose something from the photo. And I think that's our job, to bring these places back to people. And then we take our graduated filters and we take our brushes and we add depth and dimension to the things we think are worth seeing in the photo, I guess is the best way to say it. What we saw is most important. We were there. I was there. I knew that log was there. Interesting side story about this. Anybody ever been out to the Seattle, Mount Rainier area? So there's a place called Reflections Lake. And me being the guy that's like, hey, you know what? Everybody goes to Reflections Lake. I'm going to go hike somewhere and take a picture of Mount Rainier. So I do this mile hike through the woods. I get to this lake. It literally doesn't have a place to stand on the shoreline. There's a reason why Reflections Lake is so popular. It's the best place to shoot from. This was not. So I'm going through the bushes and trees, and I'm literally I have to take my shoes off. I'm standing in the water. So I know that this big log is here because I was looking for a foreground. But I think, because it's darker, I think sometimes that can get a little bit more lost in the photo. So just kind of think of things like that. And if you go to Mount Rainier, just go to Reflect. Learn from my experience and just go to the place that's got the best view. Alrighty, so let's take a look here. We can go \key before and after. Alright. I will ask a question of me for you. Matt, why do you always add a vignette on top of all your photos? I get that a lot. So I usually finish off with some type of a vignette because, again, I think portrait photographers, whether you're indoors or outdoors, portrait photographers are molding and shaping and moving and doing things with the light, right? That's their job. A good portrait photographer, if they're shooting in a dark situation, you ever watch, there's so many pros out there, but I remember one of the things I always learned from watching Joe McNally was, Joe would take these really dark scenes and he'd light it so perfectly, and you'd look at the ground and there was no light, and then I'd look at somebody else's photo and it's like they'd have a flash shining down on somebody, but it's casting light all over the ground, so we want to mold and shape that light so that it's only on the stuff that we want. And so a good portrait photographer does that. Well, when we get outside, we don't have that control, right? Everything's going to be bright. So what we kind of do with the vignette is we just bring our focus in a little bit. The edges of a photo usually can kind of get a little bit distracting and whatnot. So that vignette just kind of calms down and just kind of pulls people into the photo a little bit. That's why I usually do it. All right, let's see what time we got here. Tell you what, I'll do. Let me do a couple minutes of questions, and then I'll plow through some more photos here. So, start from here.
Maybe touch on the dehaze feature.
Good idea. The dehaze filters. I didn't touch on it. You're right, I didn't. So dehaze is one of those newer filters, new-ish, and the idea behind it, if you go over here, it's going to be in your effects panel, and this is for the CC versions of Lightroom and Photoshop. If you go over here into your effects panel, beneath the vignetting, you're going to see all the way down here at the bottom is dehaze. So dehaze is great for, kind of cutting through some haze, especially if you look a little bit hazy back there. In fact, I want to see if I got a better example here. Hold on one sec. Search. Let's go to everything, because I think I had an even hazier photo. I think that might have been one I already dehazed. That's why I was looking at it. I'm like, it doesn't really look hazy. So here's one that's definitely, you can see the haze more, and it happens a lot on mountains off in the distance and whatnot. So dehaze does a really good job of kind of cutting through that. It's kind of contrast. It looks like a little bit of contrast and blacks kind of put together in there. Does a really nice job. One of the downsides of dehaze is you can see here is that I go and I start to crank it up. If you've got a lot of color in the photo, it'll start to oversaturate, especially blue skies. So sometimes you'll want to go higher on this, and the sky starts to really get too blue. So in that case, what you can do is go to your brush tool, and there's a dehaze slider inside your brush tool. So you can crank up your dehaze slider here, and then just take your brush. I'll make it a little bit heavier for you. Just take your brush and paint it. All right. If you guys didn't know, I'll even paint a little bit there. Little tricks that I use for some of this stuff is, you'll notice I'm using a pretty large brush, and you'll also notice if you look at my brush settings, you'll notice that the feather setting is pretty high. So here, let's reset this. I don't mind it if the dehazing spreads into the bottom a little bit. I don't think the bottom needed it as bad, but I don't mind if it spreads in. So just little tricks that I use is I use a large brush, and I use a really high feather setting, so that way as I swipe down along here, I'm getting a little bit of the effect down over there, but I'm not getting the full effect down there. So that's why, if you ever notice, sometimes I'll make my brush a little bit larger, and I'll paint along the edges to blend it in with some of those edges. All right, and then as I get closer, I'll hit the left bracket key, and I'll make my brush smaller, and then I'll go and I'll paint on the edges. And if you didn't know, there's a little auto mask setting down here, right at the very bottom. So if I turn that on, I can make my brush a little bit larger. I'll use the right bracket key for that. And as I paint, dehaze, see how it's not spreading over into the sky? The main reason is because I have that checkbox on, and also, see the little crosshair in the middle? I'm keeping that crosshair. And by the way, I see people in the back. You guys have a screen next to you too, if you want to take a look over there. I know sometimes it's hard to see up here. But you can see here, as long as I keep that crosshair, it won't spread and bleed over into the sky. And if you want to see that in action, there's a little checkbox to show the overlay. But you can see it keeps it from going over there into the sky. So that's the dehaze slider. What I'm doing now with the brush is typically the way I'll use it most of the time. Very few times does the slider just do it for me. I usually have to go into the brush. And then the other thing is know when to use it. I see a lot of people like a very atmospheric photo with a lot of fog and whatnot, and they'll crank up the dehaze slider. And to me, it's like, atmosphere is great. If you can get fog and you can get that type of a look, I think it can be really good. I think dehaze is good in some of those conditions where it could be a cityscape or whatnot, and it starts to get a little bit hazy. All right, dehaze. Now back, yes, sir. Chromatic aberration in the lens correction settings. So that's a tough one because I gotta find a photo that I have chromatic aberrations on. Let's see if I can find one. This might be one. Of course, that one's not hooked up. Hold on. All right, let's see. Yeah, it's gonna be tough. We got a pixel peep for this one. Chromatic aberrations will tend to be a fringe that goes along the edge of some kind of a contrasty separation. So if you go down here, his gentleman's question was, I haven't really been clicking on remove chromatic aberration. I haven't really been seeing it a lot in the photos I've been working on. But if you do see it, this checkbox, man, I wish I could find a photo that we have it on. I'll have to go back to it. But it does make a difference. Like when you see it, you'll see it. There'll be a green or a red fringe around something, and that checkbox really does work wonders. So hopefully we'll come across a photo that's got one.
Is there anything wrong with simply clicking it on as a default?
And so the follow-up to that was, is there anything wrong with simply just leaving it on as a default or just clicking it on? No, it's not really going to do anything. If there's no fringe there, there's really nothing to remove, and it's not. I haven't ever seen it negatively affect the photo. All the back, ma'am. Yes.
Some really beautiful sunsets, but it's intense, and I found that these professional art cameras, there's a lot of yellow. You can't capture the real color, and you want to find to try to play with the camera. How do you basically get the yellow out of sunset photos without changing everything?
So you want to get the yellow out of a sunset photo?
Because it's not as accurate.
I would say.
You just look at
Yeah.
the yellow. Very, very
So two things. If the photo, and you said sometimes there's a strip of yellow in the sky or something like that.
where the sun is, where it's intense, the field is not the way it looks. It's actually very red
Yeah.
and paper in actuality, but it's background yellow.
All right. A couple of things to think about that. If it's too red or too yellow. Number one, shoot in RAW. That should help. Shoot in RAW. From there is if the yellow is a problem kind of across the whole photo, you could use your temperature slider and kind of cheat it over toward the blue side a little bit. If the yellow's focused in on a smaller area, I would try one of your filters here, maybe the brush filter or the brush tool, and maybe take the saturation down a little bit, and then you could just try to paint across an area. See if that will help. And then the only other thing that I can give you is going to be under HSL. You could go to your yellow saturation or luminance, and you could try to tweak your yellow sliders there as well. All right, I know I saw another one. Somebody put their hand down. They had it up before. They put it. Okay. I'll push forward. All right, let's move on here. So I lost my collection. There we go. All right, so let's move on to. I've been working on pretty weather. Let's move to when the weather's not so pretty. So what can we do there? Well, I think first thing, again, shadows, highlights. In this case, this is actually a black sand beach. So I don't need to go this far with it because it's supposed to be. I'm probably going to go further than it looked. Because the hard part about a black sand beach is most people don't see them, so it's like, then why is the beach so dark? So yeah, I always cheat my photos from this area and kind of went a little bit further with them. So kind of open up the shadows there. We can go over here to our crop tool. And then maybe just grab my straighten, drag along there. You can see it's got a little bit of a curvature to it. If that bugs you right away, I've been doing this a little bit later in the workflow, but you could go straight down to your lens corrections here and enable that profile correction, and it should take care of most of that. Back up here to basic. Whites and blacks, Option or Alt click. I'm not gonna push this all the way to the blacks, but I'll go until I get a couple little specks there. Let's go take the sky. We'll use our graduated filter on it and bring the exposure down. So this is where I have a little bit of fun, and that is, if I have a gray blah sky, I'm not going to go crazy, like make it really dark. But if I have a blah sky, I'll pull it back, and then I'll crank up some clarity in it too. So basically, just go with it. If you weren't really lucky on the pretty sunrise or the pretty sunset, then go dramatic. Push it a little bit. So between pulling down your exposure but not going too far, maybe even a little bit on the highlights, and then cranking up that clarity, you'll get a much more dramatic sky. Like so. And that might be a little too much, so I'll pull back there. Alright, let's see here. We have a little spot. So let's go grab my spot removal brush. Click on that. And sadly, there are more. They were hiding, but they're there. I'm not going to go get rid of all of them because you guys will want to shoot me, but I'll get rid of a couple of them. Little side note for you. When you bring down the exposure in the sky and when you add a lot of clarity to your sky, you're going to bring out spots even more. So what